Hello everyone, welcome to another episode. I think this video is made at the perfect timing as of today or yesterday, Google is announcing that they are gonna lay off 9,000 people, but not sure if that's a rumor or not. A lot of also tech companies are laying off people constantly throughout the years, and hopefully you are not affected by that, finger crossed. And if you are, don't worry, continue to listen to this conversation with Cameron. He is a recruiter working in FAANG company, DoorDash, Snapchat for about 20 years. And hopefully his experience, his advice coming from a recruiter is helpful for you to help you land your job in a very short time period and also get into a really good compensation that you deserve. Continue to listen if you're interested, and hopefully it's helpful for you. Hi, cool. Nice meeting you, Cameron. Today I have Cameron on the call here. He has been in the recruiting field for a lot of years, like 10, 20 years experience. He's very senior in the role. I would like to interview him about recruiting, compensation, how you should negotiate your offer. And take it to you, Cameron. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much for having me, Yvonne. My name is Cameron Khani. I've been in recruiting for almost 20 years now. And so I love to be able to give tips to candidates, obviously during interview processes, but also just from like a general standpoint. And had a really awesome experience, working with you, and then would love to kind of help other job seekers, as I know the climate of looking for opportunities right now is quite challenging. So if there's anything that I can do to make it a little bit more of a transparent process, would love to do so.
Awesome. Yeah, we will get into a few questions about like from the starting point of recruiting call and then compensation and then the details to be aware of. So probably starting with the first question here, like what are the smart questions that candidate can ask at the beginning of the recruiting call to understand what is actually expected in the role?
Yeah, so you can look at a job description and sometimes it's very well written, other times it's very vague. So I think, just being able to understand, okay, what are the top, 3 skill sets or the top 5 skill sets that you're, looking to hit on. And so, ideally, you want to figure out what is the total package that the team is looking for, but then also what are the must-haves? And I think if you have those must-haves, that's great. I think that's important for starters. And I think if you can have, those top 3 skill sets, but then of course, on top of that, any sort of like nice to haves, that's when you're really, playing with house money and you're able to, be a top candidate for a role. So I think, super important to be able to, get a full understanding of those skill sets, those technologies that you need to have, and then be able to speak intelligently about your experience using them and, come up with, several different, situations that you've been in where, maybe you worked with that technology and what was the outcome of your work, and kind of talking through with data and being able to explain that.
Exactly. And also there's a big gap, or it's kind of vague. You couldn't tell from the job description that what the team is exactly looking for. So maybe asking the recruiter like what kind of project they're looking for to do and what are the expected person that the hiring manager is looking for, I guess.
Yeah, for instance, let's say, you're looking at a very niche data scientist role, and we're looking for very specific, let's say graph database experience. And so this is something that doesn't just come preloaded for any, data scientist. It's kind of through either education or, maybe you did some work in fraud detection, or maybe you did some work in, employee analytics. And so I think, just being able to, understand, okay, no, this is actually a niche role. And look through the job description and maybe they mention graph database a few times, but really that's the most important part for the role. And so, got to be able to explain that sort of experience and how I can help the team with that.
Totally. And also on the other perspective, so how can you help a candidate to prepare the interview? Like, for example, they might ask like, what are, if there are 5 rounds of interview, what are in the details of each round? Would you think that's going to be helpful? And what questions, if they ask, will be helpful for them?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I think it's always about understanding what are the focus areas of every single interview? Not just like the generalities, but really, focus areas around, okay, is this a behavioral cultural interview? Or is this going to be more of like a code pair? Or is this going to be like a HackerRank interview? And then understanding, okay, are they going to do front end? Are they going to do back end? Mixture of both, system design. And then it's all about understanding, okay, are these textbook questions or are these really, more of those, again, behavioral cultural questions where you're going to have to understand the company's values or mission or, different, kind of things that they're looking for. So for instance, I think being able to get a full picture of that sort of, value of the company. And so, what are those values looking like? How do you live those values in a work setting? And then, how do those come out in, some of the conversations you've had with, your counterparts, whether it's from the stakeholders, cross-functional folks. And so I think just the full understanding of how do I bring my experience and my skills into the interview process through answering some of these questions that are very sometimes vague and sometimes very pointed. So you want to make sure, okay, this is a question that I have to be very high level, but also be in the details, or maybe even a mixture of both at times.
Totally. I think in each round of interview, they have something they want to get out of the candidate. Like they are very clear what they're looking for. So I guess those questions are going to be really helpful. So moving on to the question, like you probably have worked with a lot of candidates in the past few years. So what separates the good ones from the average one before the interview, before the actual interview in the recruiting calls?
Yeah, so you want to know that they did their homework on the company, on the team. Maybe they've read the engineering blog. Maybe they have a full understanding of, the team that they'd be joining. Perhaps they came through a referral from someone on the team, so they might even have a real snapshot of what they're doing on a daily basis. So I think the research is super important, but I think also researching the recruiter, researching the hiring manager, researching the team that they'll be interviewing with, trying to connect those dots even before the recruiter tells you who you might be meeting with is pretty important. And then, maybe someone at the company that can shed some light on things that you may not have, prior knowledge to. So I think those are some key indicators, but also it's being able to have an easy back and forth conversation with the recruiter and not making it a challenging conversation for the recruiter. Maybe, my toughest interviews are the ones where, someone's speaking really quickly. I need to slow them down and they're just using a bunch of buzzwords or keywords that really don't explain the work that they were doing. I'd rather just a good explanation of, hey, I worked at this company most recently. Do you want me to talk about my background first, or would you like me to talk about my most recent work? Sometimes the recruiter wants you to talk about most recent work, mostly, and doesn't really care about your background. So if you, go back to, I've been doing, engineering work since, the late 90s, and start talking about, late 90s work that you were doing, and then eventually talking about your current work, it's going to be the longest conversation ever, and then it's not going to be productive, and you've already been rejected. So I think those are, some really key points to make sure that you hit on, so that you're also staying with the agenda. Recruiter is going to say, hey, we have 15 minutes for this call, or maybe it's been 15 minutes allotted, so they don't even need to tell you that. So you understand, okay, first 5 minutes is going to be a little bit of an intro. Next 5 minutes is going to be a little bit of, back and forth. Maybe they'll ask you some questions. You'll answer a little bit about your, most recent experience and kind of, your tech stack and why you're looking, and, what are your expectations and motivations towards the end. So really it's going to be a quick conversation. And I think within the first 5 minutes, the recruiter is going to know most likely if you're going to be passing for them.
Exactly. I think everybody needs to have like a 5-minute or 3-minute prep call selling themselves. So to be really clear about what they have done in the past few years, or what's the most recent project, and have highlights of their skill sets. So that's a good balance between saying too much and then saying too less.
Yeah, and you also want to show a little bit of interest. You don't want to be playing it too cool, but you don't want to also be too excited about the role. I think a little bit of a happy medium where you're showing the interest, but also it's based on like reasons, your expectations and motivations should back up why you want this opportunity and why you need to have it.
Totally. Yeah, that's very cool. So then let's talk about compensation. That's like something everybody cares a lot actually, because so then about compensation will be a good question to ask for. Like at the beginning in the recording call, maybe at the end, people always ask like, what is your expected salary? So will be a good answer, or how should they respond to that question? Should they say an exact number, or should they say a range, or will be a good idea?
That's a good question. So, yeah, let's say, for instance, you're the job seeker. I'm like, okay, where would you like to be, from a compensation standpoint? If you're a smart job seeker, you can almost spin it back to them. You could say, what have you budgeted for this role? What is that range that you budgeted for the role? And then you understand, okay, I'm playing within these two, numbers. And then obviously you want to know, all right, what level is this role and what level am I? Is this a principal level role and I'm like a senior and I'm like stretching to this principal level role? Well, you're probably going to want to be at the early part of that range versus, yes, I'm the most principal person in this position. Then you could probably ask for, towards the top part of the range. But you never want to ask for the tip top part of the range, because I think you're just going to set yourself up for failure. And also, sometimes they can't even hit the top part of the range. You can get close to it, but not the top part. So those are some good parameters. But always, and you never want to tell anyone how much you're making. I think that's also a key thing. So you can tell them, yeah. But if like, the role pays less than what you've been making, you can kind of let them know, hey, I have been making in this general area, and the role pays less than what I've been making. I think a lot of times they're not able to make adjustments, especially at bigger companies, whereas maybe a startup, they can flex a little bit, but sometimes there's reasons why maybe they want to have pay equity across the board at the company, and they can't pay more because it would be unfair to their current employees for someone who's external coming into the company.
Totally. By not giving the exact number, it just don't make yourself too high or too low, because you're not sure where you're at for the company sometimes. So probably ask for the band and be aware of what's the level you're hiring for, because the level probably already set you for a certain range. So that's
yeah. And there's nothing more frustrating as a recruiter if a candidate says, I'm not going to tell you how much I want to make, and then where do you go from there? You really can't, and so I think that happens from time to time. Like, I'm not going to tell you how much I make or how much I'm looking for. You can kind of figure it out, based on, the market. But I think, like, also some people are like, the range looks great. I'm not too concerned. I'm sure we'll be able to make it work. Those are fine. But also I like to have specificity as, do you want to be anywhere on the range? Like, if I gave you the lowest amount on the range, you would take it right now. So I think, like, getting an understanding of that as a recruiter is important, and not making it a guessing game for your recruiter, really giving them all the information that they need to give you what you want at the end of the day.
Yeah, totally. So then, so what's the right way to negotiate without sounding entitled? Because some people are just asking for the high number, right? They care about a big salary and wishing to be top tier of the band. So how to not sound like too eager for the money, and what will be a good way to do that, and how to think about that actually?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most important skills to have. It's I think being able to influence them with the data that you have. And so, for instance, yeah, maybe you're walking away from a really big bonus coming up. Maybe your equity is about to vest. Maybe your RCs are about to vest. Giving your recruiter those timelines, there's probably an opportunity for them to understand, okay, there's a delta here that we need to make up for, and maybe we can do it in one of three different ways. Maybe increasing the base compensation, maybe increasing the equity, maybe even providing some sort of a sign-on bonus or bonus. So if you're able to really convey the timeline of those kind of monies that you're expecting, then you're able to just be really transparent as far as, like, okay, this is where we're how off we are, and how can we get to that place. And it's really sometimes like going to a car dealership and leasing a car. you have an idea of what you want to pay when you walk in there. Same deal. You have an idea of what you want to be paid. And so, you don't want to go through too much of a back and forth. Really, you have that first conversation about compensation. You keep talking about compensation if you need to, but really it's a first conversation, then probably later on. And then if everybody's on board, these little details you don't want to throw in at the end of the day. You want to be able to maybe talk about them, a little bit earlier, so that it's not a surprise for a recruiter. And then all of a sudden there's nothing they can do because they've already kind of built this into what they're going to be presenting you at later stages.
Exactly. And also all of the money talk is on the top of you're performing really well in an interview. And then if you want to argue a bit more based on what you have on the table from other company or previous company as of equity or offer, then that's something probably to ask for, but also see the balances of what they can actually give you versus like if also this is a role you want to have, and be genuine about what are you representing yourself. Because some people might just be asking for or arguing between different company and go back and forth a lot of times. And then one of the companies or a few of the company are actually being angry about this candidate trying to get the money and withdraw the offer. So be aware of that at the same time.
Yeah, that's a key point. I think, you'll have leverage if you're doing really well in the process, but you don't want to get too, aggressive with that. And I think additionally, I've had situations where I had a candidate with many offers in hand, and it gets to a place where those are the candidates you want to avoid because they're not going to sign with you. They're just going to get another offer and then leverage it for something else. And so, or they're just not serious, and they, or maybe they have a really highly coveted skill set, and they're just going to go for the best offer, and I think they can. And you don't want to be in that game where you're competing against, a Netflix that pays top dollar, but also will hire and fire. And so maybe you just say, hey, feel free to, go with the highest bidder on that, one out of your 6 offers. But, I think you can get into a lot of trouble if you're talking to a candidate that's, just collecting offers, and you can get a really good sense of that pretty easily versus someone who's like serious about your actual job, your company, your team. They want to work with that team. They've been sending thank you notes, and you can get a big, just understanding of what someone's motivations are through, some of these conversations.
Yeah. So 2 of the strategy takeaway from like an interviewer here is, firstly, write a thank you letter after interview if you're really genuine about the team, about the company. Secondly, is to be expressing the interest to seriously join the company, and then maybe asking for a higher salary or if you have a competing offer. So that's something that they should probably do to make them into a better place.
Yeah, and there are instances where, let's say you're talking to an actual real competitor, maybe you work at Meta and, Google, wants to talk to you or vice versa. And so I think that when you have interviews with other competitors, sometimes it makes them more interested in you to be able to, pull you to their company versus going to the competitor.
Totally. And also, I know that at the end of before the final offer, people might ask, or recruiter might ask, if you accept the offer, if I made one like today or tomorrow. So what would be the right way to respond to that instead of making an instant jump into the offer and maybe regret later?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways. First off, I think the best way is just being honest. Like, hey, I don't like jumping the gun and just, signing on something immediately. I really, whenever I sign something important or make a big life decision, I need to talk to my wife about it, or I need to, talk to my dog about it, or my neighbor, and so, I think, everyone has a different person that they, rely on, or maybe they have to talk to their mentor. And I think if you are just kind of rushing someone to sign, maybe that's a bad sign for them. And I think you have to also understand, why are you rushing me? Sometimes someone will have an exploding offer and they're like, all right, you need to sign by tomorrow. Otherwise we're not going to offer you. So you need to understand, is this team serious about me, or is this recruiter being hyper aggressive, and you need to kind of give them parameters as far as how soon you can sign. And sure, if you say, I need the weekend, but you know what, I might just sign tomorrow. Who knows? If not sooner. And so I think you give your recruiter a really good understanding of like, okay, this is the percentage that I'm going to sign. This is how soon I'm going to sign. You know, do you have any hesitations that I may have? I may want to talk to the hiring manager again and say, you know, I just wanted to double check, you know, a few of these things, or maybe even talk to their manager that you talked to through the interview process. So it's always important to, you know, when you're going to maybe take a verbal offer and say, hey, I'm going to sign that document, that your verbal offer is really binding, even though it isn't, it really should be, because you have an intention to make that, you know, signature on the DocuSign.
Totally. Would you recommend, because a lot of people ask like, is a verbal promises binding? Like, do people ask for like, can you send me an email? What's the number you just give me? Not the official letter, but at least have something written down in case they hear something wrong and afterwards they just regret it and be like, oh, that's not something that I imagined for, what I misheard, or something like that.
Yeah. So, you know, for instance, if you're interviewing for a role that has a base compensation and equity compensation, you know, at the very least, you know, let's say the recruiter, it takes time for them to get something approved, an offer approved over to you. Maybe it takes a day or two. They need to talk to someone in Europe. Then I think the key move would be, all right, I just want to have something to go off of so that I know when I get that document that it's going to have that base compensation, that equity, and then just send me an email, you know, put that all in writing, and then it makes it a lot easier to digest. And then really at the end of the day, you're just, you know, dotting I's and crossing T's when you get that final document sent into your inbox.
Yeah, totally. That's a great advice. So what would be one of the red flag of the recruiting call? I guess that's just like final career advice. Through all of the process, what will be red flags that you're looking out for?
Don't come late. Don't come late. Don't not show up. You know, and then if you show up, I think you really want to be able to be in a place that's quiet. If you're sitting like in a car, that's not a good move. If someone else is in, you know, the back seat, that's terrible. So I've seen almost everything across the board as far as like, you know, do's and don'ts. Sure, I've had really good calls with people in random areas, and everyone's working, and we understand that. And so, you know, I think, you know, the least you could do is, you know, walk into, you know, a little quiet office or area. You don't want to be in like the loudest Starbucks in town with, you know, spotty internet coverage. And so, you know, there's so many red flags constantly. I mean, you know, maybe, you know, talking about you work at a stealth startup, but you can't even say what you do or where you work. You know, maybe your resume has different dates than your LinkedIn. There's a lot of fake candidates out there that I've heard crazy stories of someone, you know, having their friend in the background and they were lip singing and, you know, having the other person talk for them in an interview. So there's so many stories that, you know, I've heard even, you know, with my own two eyes. And so I think additionally, you know, just being able to not throw keywords and buzzwords against the wall and see what sticks, but really just have a real conversation, a human conversation. Like, hey, you know, I worked, you know, at ABC company. This is what I did. I built a web application using, you know, everything from React to JavaScript to Node to Angular. So, you know, just not listing every technology you've ever worked with, but really not being able to attribute it to an actual project.
Yeah, totally. I think the whole purpose of recording call in here is to save the company's time, because asking all of the managers and people to interview a candidate is really expensive. So recorders here are to help to sort out the ones that really worth the time and also be a good candidate for what is the company's looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't say it better myself.
Yeah. Awesome. It's nice meeting you, Cameron. Hope
Such
to
a pleasure.
keep in touch. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I know you're starting out your own business recently about the recruiting company. Can you tell me more about that? I'm just so curious if anybody need help about recruiting, about interviewing, can they reach out to you for any suggestions or coaching?
Absolutely. So I do have a side business where, you know, on nights and weekends, I'm able to assist anyone with really any sort of job seeking advice. Let's say you want to brush up your resume, or you have a really big interview coming up, or you have a big offer that you're, maybe a couple different offers you're deciding between, or you want to make a pivot in your career, or, you just want to vent about something, that happened in your job, or, really, I think it's across the board. There's really no sort of, like one size fits all type situation, but really, across the board, any sort of job seeking advice that you might need, happy to help in any way. And feel free to reach out to me to hear more.
Definitely. I will put his info down in the comment section below, so feel free to reach out to him afterwards.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you. You too. Thanks, Yvonne.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.